Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. This time we're going to be speaking to Dr Alessandra Pino about A Gothic Cookbook, so expect a lot of talk about food and the Gothic in this one. Now, Dr Pino is an expert on how the Gothic food and cultural memory intersect, and Alessandra was born in Hampstead, London, to an Italian mother and Venezuelan diplomat father, and she grew up in several different countries. She holds university degrees in English literature from Naples, Laurentale, translation studies from the University of Westminster, and a PhD in food, cultural memory, and the Gothic. She worked with a Michelin starred chef for nearly 10 years before entering the world of dark academia. And Alessandra brings to A Gothic Cookbook her deep academic knowledge, digging into food themes and motifs in a series of classic and contemporary novels from the 19th century to the present day. And I'm quite looking forward to this one because I love the Gothic and I love food. So let's get into it. Right, hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore Presents. And this month we're talking to Dr. Alessandra Pino about A Gothic Cookbook. So welcome to Fabulous Folklore Presents.
Thank you so much for having me on, Icy. I'm so excited because we're now at, I think it's 94% funded. So really, we've got just 6% to go.
So before we start then, do you want to explain what A Gothic Cookbook is and also how Unbound works as well? Because a lot of people might not have come across this model of publishing before.
Yeah, sure. Yes, that's why I mentioned that we're 94% funded, because it's actually a crowdfunding platform, and we get people who are interested in the idea to pledge for the book in advance. And we also have different pledge levels, and some are a little bit outlandish, so I might explain them a little bit later. So there are different types of pledges that people can pay for, and that means that we get the book funded with Unbound. And it's quite a unique idea. So that's why we went with Unbound, because traditional publishers found it a little bit difficult to maybe understand, and they categorized it as being just a little bit too niche. But it is a unique cookbook, and it's the first Gothic cookbook in the world. So Ella and I are really proud of that. And I'm writing it with my friend Ella, who's a food journalist. And she is, like me, really passionate about all things food. So it's a special project because it provides new and original food perspectives when it comes to literature, a new insight into how food operates specifically within the context of some of the most well-known Gothic novels. So we'll have over 60 recipes inspired by the text and the food in those texts, as well as some really beautiful hand-drawn illustrations by the talented Lee Henry of Ounce of Style. I cannot stress how many people have reached out just to say how beautiful the illustrations are. And so I'm really proud of that as well.
Yeah, the illustrations are lovely because obviously you can see the excerpt pages on the Unbound page, which I will put the link below.
Yes.
And I looked at it and I was like, that's the thing that I think makes all the difference. So instead of it being like just photographs of food, it's like these really beautiful, quite lush, really Gothic illustrations.
Yeah, they are. And to begin with, we started quite gently just with a few Dracula illustrations, and I hadn't really realized the full potential of what Lee was able to produce. But I was like just taken aback. It's become, I think one of my favorites is some of the drawings that he's done for Rebecca. They are just so beautiful, and it's got increasingly and increasingly more Gothic as time's gone on. So I think it's rubbing off on him. So I'm really happy with that.
Excellent. I love the idea of like infectious Gothic. That's always a good one.
Because he wasn't necessarily into like his Gothic drawings to begin with, but now he is like a fully fledged Gothic illustrator, and there aren't that many around. So yeah,
that's who started a new niche basically, but in illustration.
Yeah, and as I said, this is the first Gothic cookbook, you know, in the world. There hasn't been one before, and I think that was one of the main issues that we had with publishers. They said, well, the idea doesn't exist. Why would it catch on? You know, no one's thought of this before. And actually, Unbound were really great because they took this on board, and they were like, this is a great idea. It's original, and we've got to make it look like a big spell book, so it looks Gothic as well. And obviously the idea of Gothic food within is also very interesting, and it's something that's often not talked about within the Gothic community. So I'm really happy to be introducing this topic.
So that was the thing I was wondering about, because obviously the Gothic is such a massive area, and obviously kind of you're sort of at the food end of the spectrum, like I tend to sit at the film end of the spectrum. So it kind of does show how it encompasses like so many things.
Yeah.
I mean, I did see an article where someone tried to claim that Martha Stewart was Gothic, which I thought might be pushing it just a tad. But where did the idea sort of come from? Did it come from the food that's already in the books, or was it just an own personal interest?
Yeah, well, it's funny you should mention the film side of things, because I was doing a PhD and I started from food and film. That's how I started, food and horror. And often I would notice that before and after a food scene, you would either get the appearance of the devil, some sort of, satanic occurrence, poltergeist or ghosts or death or misery or some sort of. And I thought, how interesting, starting all the way back from Ghostbusters, even with the fridge scene, lots of fridge scenes where you open them, the monsters in the fridge, and close associations to food. And that was how I started. And that was where the beginning of my PhD then took me on a bit of a tangent, because I'm doing I did cultural memory and food. But the tangent then was, how does the Gothic come into this, and what does it mean in our day and age, and why are we associating all this tension and anxiety with food? And it's clearly comes across from the films that we see in all the horror. So that was how it kind of began. And Ella knew about this, knew I was doing my PhD in food and horror, and she tried to get me a book on this. And she said, look, I can't find any cookbooks on food and horror. And she sent me an Edgar Allan Poe book, and I was like, this is like beautiful, and it looks just like, big black cloth bound book. And I thought, wow, could we do a book like this but just with Gothic recipes? Because it doesn't exist. And so that's how it all started. And we got really carried away with it. And we started writing it even before it was signed. We got signed up with anyone. So before the publishing house actually accepted us, we were already writing the first chapters, because we were so excited about it. Like, for us, it was quite it was an interesting topic, and we knew that it could interest people as well, even though the first kind of feedback that we got was quite negative. But yeah, so that's how we got started. And the idea behind a Gothic cookbook basically is that food has a language of its own, and it's able to tell a story of its own. So it isn't just a prop or an embellishment. So it has its own voice, and this voice can let you into some of the novel's darkest secrets that perhaps even the author, when they were writing what they were writing, didn't fully understand what they were doing with the food, because it's kind of part of our subconscious in many ways. So that I found really fascinating.
I think it's quite interesting, because obviously one of the things that I get really like obsessive about is like the Victorian language of flowers, and how when you go back and read novels from the time, and like they're actually full of all these messages where the authors like described flower beds in like weird detail that to us is a bit like, okay, but then you're like, oh my god, they were actually saying a message. So I'm guessing food does the same thing and has this whole way of communicating.
Yes, and it's not the first time someone's talked to me about these like the language of flowers, and it's like we've kind of lost that nowadays. Food has always been there, but it's whether you notice it or not. In fact, I have to say, I see many times I have read these books, and for initial reading, when I wasn't reading it from a food point of view, I hardly notice the food, especially in Gothic novels. It's not the first thing that comes to mind. But then when you do read it with food in mind, it's everywhere. And I think similar to what you do with folklore, we can see it as it acting like a warning sign or some sort of pretext to start on an adventure or a journey, just like in Little Red Riding Hood, for example. It can be a lack of food that drives the plot forward, or it can be a carrier of poison. So in each and every one of these Gothic novels, you have food acting in this way. And once you start noticing it, you just can't stop. It's an addiction.
It's quite funny. I'm just thinking, because one of the things I'm looking at with my PhD is obviously haunted house films. And one of the things I'm looking at is set design. So when you're saying food as a prop, they keep using it as a prop to show, ooh, like there's a supernatural event here, because the food suddenly rots like immediately. And it's funny how it's always fruit that they use.
Yes, you get fruit a lot rotting and insects inside the fruit. Also, you get the idea of modernity wreaking some sort of havoc. So you get things in microwaves happening that, fridges that are opening, and then suddenly you get the jump scare every time the fridge closes, or you get something in the cupboard creeping out. You know, even in Gremlins or any sort of horror, even if it's a little bit comedic, you know, you still get the idea of in the kitchen, it's quite central to where the action takes place. And I think it's because it's the heart of the home. So it's where bad things shouldn't happen in reality, but it's where families congregate, but also where they self-destruct. So you see that, for example, in Maggie, where there's a zombification process that actually takes place in the kitchen initially, or in The Possession, where the main character actually says she's vegan or vegetarian. And then you see her transformation and you know that something is wrong because she's eating raw meat on the floor outside her fridge. So you just think, yeah, something's gone wrong here. And it's the way that the supernatural has to connecting to the human being, because how can you connect to the body? Well, you do that through food, because food is part of us and we eat at least 3 times a day, or you know, something like that. So it's something that we are very much involved with in the preparation and everything else. So it becomes very, very important to signifying what it means as human beings. So something which isn't human, in order to pretend to be human, uses food. At least that's my interpretation of why food is so often used. And then, you know, I did a talk for Romancing the Gothic on pizza and other forms of like fast food and what they mean, because often they are associated to families which are in some way incomplete. So single parent families where you have a rushed meal, and you know that shortly after the pizza scene where the mother hasn't cooked, you know, but she's just put a slice of pizza on a plate, there's nothing wrong with that. But something is about to happen, you know, something terrible will happen in nearly every film, like Annabelle, or even Lights Out. You know, any mainstream horror film will have that kind of pizza scene at some point in one of their many trilogies or whatever.
Yeah, I'm literally just thinking there's literally one in the remake of Poltergeist, and it's literally pizza.
Yeah, and it's pizza.
It was funny you mentioned burgers and vegans, or because I watched a film which wasn't the worst film I've ever seen, called The Young Cannibals, earlier in the year. And in that one, it's like these kids are basically turned into cannibals by being given free burgers, but they don't really question what the meat is. And there's one kid who doesn't have one because he's vegan. And it's really interesting the way that it's kind of, they almost use food to kind of comment on like the changes in society as well.
Absolutely. And on someone's morality and ethical stance as well. You know, if you're a vegan, then you're someone who respects the environment. But in a strange twist of fate, now what horror films are doing is, because I think they've run out of ideas when it comes to that, or we kind of have exhausted that, the vegans are the monsters. And that takes me back to Frankenstein, where actually Frankenstein's monster or being, creation, is vegetarian. So it starts from that. So that's when I talked to you about like how I was working out how Gothic food worked into like the horror and the films in my PhD. That's what I was going back to, like, why did those changes occur? Why are we seeing monsters that actually don't eat what humans eat, and what does that mean? You know, what does it mean in terms of the plot, and what the author wants us to think about that monster as well. Yeah,
I was, but the other thing that I've got like constantly going on a loop in my head at the moment is the Custard scene from Brain Dead, which actually put me off eating. I mean, I never really liked custard to start with, but now I'm just like,
yeah, custard is not my thing either. Anything which is like like soup is okay, but not too gloopy. That kind of consistency is something which I think during the 80s appeared, above all in the 80s, like as quite a standard thing when it came to creating a sense of disgust, which is why initially we had quite a few problems with the idea of the Gothic cookbook and introducing recipes, because people would literally say, no way, like, we don't want eyeballs in a cake. I'm like, we're not going to do eyeballs in cake, guys. Like, we're just taking the food items in these 13 Gothic novels and we're creating recipes which are tasty and edible and come from like traditional recipes. It's not going to be that kind of grotesque idea of Gothic food which has existed up until now, which is why it makes it something new.
Because I think one of the things I thought was really interesting is that you've got some sort of interesting characters that you've picked from the books. I know the one for Rebecca you've got, and I can't remember her name, but the woman at the beginning that the new Mrs. De Winter as the companion for. So, and I thought that was really interesting that you weren't just simply going like, "Oh, let's just stick to the protagonist," because
Yeah.
often the incidental characters are more interesting in Gothic literature.
Yeah, I think you can get a real kind of taste of what is going to happen from food. And sometimes with these characters, they're kind of giving us a bit of an insight into the rest of the characters as well. And we can get an inkling of like, okay, something bad is about to happen. You know, there's this food scene between the second Mrs. De Winter and Maxim, and he's feeding her a tangerine and he proposes to her. And, you know, from the outside, that might seem quite romantic. But as he's like picking each segment apart and like placing it in her mouth, it's actually quite I don't want to say degrading is too strong a word, but definitely slightly condescending, and as if he's feeding her. And she, while she's eating, she has these kind of flashbacks or memories to, to a sense of unease or anxiety. So this association between this tangerine and these thoughts about Maxim, it's nearly like he's introducing future pain and angst into her life through the food. At least that was how I interpreted it. And yeah, never has there been a more less gothic, you know, food than a tangerine. But actually, it is in that case, and it's a sense of control as well because you're feeding someone, so you get that kind of childlike in feeling, and yeah, it's just lots of elements that make it quite an unsettling scene. And I think still now people, especially I think in a few discussions that we've had, they do see Maxim as like a romantic hero, and that, you know, he did nothing wrong. No spoilers, but like that's not true. Like we really disagree with that. A little bit like Mr. Rochester as well, who's portrayed as this romantic hero. But if you read the text, there are quite a few things that are quite disturbing, and with both of these romantic characters. So I see those characters as villains actually, and not so romantic.
I think
yeah,
that's the funny thing when you look at like the film version of Rebecca. And obviously the fact that because it was Laurence Olivier, they were like, oh, we can't tarnish his image, so we'll have to change what actually happened so we could make him come out of it well. But he's mean to her the entire time.
Yes, absolutely. And same with Mr. Rochester. He calls her a witch. He puts her up in her room, says, you can't come down, I'm entertaining people. You know, he's awful. But that's seen as perhaps quite a manly thing to do. I don't know. And it's like, oh, real men don't exist anymore. We had some people writing on this forum where we were chatting about these characters. It's like, that's a real man. So that was, yeah. So there's been like interesting debate about it, and that's been through the lens of food as well. So that's really great. Like it's got people talking. So that's the thing about food consumption. It really goes much, much deeper than just nutrition or sustenance or making recipes, or, you know, food is actually layered with so much meaning and cultural meaning. So, you know, those aspects of the world that are intangible and then have become part of our own heritage, we don't see that, and it's all included in foods. You know, things like social inclusion, exclusion, power, they're all layers that are contained within food, and we might not notice them initially.
I think that's the thing, like when I always get quite annoyed at a lot of the current diet culture for many reasons, but part of it is that kind of insistence on you have to cut out these entire food groups because they're bad, and I'm like, are they though? And it's like, because that's if I'm having that for a moment of joy in a busy day, is that necessarily a bad thing? And I think that's where it's quite interesting to see how food's then used to kind of connect, or what's the word, what's the opposite of connect, sort of separate people in these texts.
Absolutely, yeah. And you can distinguish them into different groups, and you can belong to the group that eats only organic food, or you can belong to the group that has, you know, just veggie sausages or whatever. But really, when it comes down to it, food has become closely associated to anxiety. And I think that's something that we're seeing increasingly, also because we can't fully trust what we eat. And just to go back to food as a signifier, it's still something that is from the outside world that you actually place inside your own body. And it is, you know, you're introducing something that is essentially other into yourself. And that's quite a big deal. And so it's totally understandable that we want to make choices when it comes to that moment. But even when we do make those choices, are those choices actually for us to make, in the sense that how much do we get to decide? How much do we know? What are those things? How are those things organic? What kind of meat is that? Is that really beef, or is it something else? We don't, how at the origin of it, there is a sense of mistrust, and there have been often mix-ups and situations where you think, oh, that was wrong. That was, we've been so much separated from the sites of production. We have to trust what's in the supermarket. So I think all of that has contributed definitely to the way that through media food is portrayed, and there is that sense of anxiety for sure.
In a way as well, it's like food kind of then becomes a form of shorthand, I think, because I just suddenly thought, like, with a lot of the stuff that we've had in the news about sort of the cost of living crisis and things like that, and there's a part of me in the back of my head thinks we've got a current government who would probably sign off on Soylent Green if they thought they could get away with it. And it's just, it's funny how that then becomes shorthand for this means a particular thing without you needing to articulate it.
Absolutely. And of course, a lot of the talk around Brexit was concerning food, and where we were going to import chicken from now, where we were going to import different things, and what control was there over how they'd been produced. So there's this author, Sidney Mintz, who in the 80s already in his book, Sweetness and Power, talks about this separation and this kind of mystery that exists between where something is produced and where the end consumer then produces it, buys it, and then has to trust what has gone on behind the scenes. And you see this in horror all the time, which is something I really love. Like when you see the kitchen doors open slightly and there's something unsettling happening, and then there are people at the dining room table that are just oblivious and are just eating something that, what's going on in the kitchen. I think there's a scene in Get Out where the maid is holding a cake and you just slightly see the door open and she looks very robotic. She really reminds me of Mrs. Dudley in The Haunting of Hill House, where everything is very, very robotic, and you get this idea that, oh, is this food really wholesome? What are we eating? And it goes hand in hand with this idea of the uncanny as well, because food is meant to be familiar, and yet it's always unfamiliar because it's never part of us until we make it part of us. So it's the whole process, which is extremely Gothic. I mean, food is an extremely Gothic thing, really, if you think about it. We're keeping ourselves alive, but we're one day nearer to death every time. Let's keep it cheerful, I see.
I was going to say I should use that bit as like the bit to promote the episode.
Yeah.
So on a slightly lighter note, would you say out of all the characters that you picked, then have you got a favourite, and why?
I think one of my favorites, I just think how the novel was written, and the style of writing, and how the absolute sense of dread is portrayed through food as an escalation, has to be Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. I mean, you start off with them just having a really innocent tuna sandwich picnic on the floor of their new beautiful flat, and it ends up with all sorts of weird smoothies and and food and steaks and all this sense of like ceremony around gatherings and the dinners and all of that makes something terrible so formal, and you nearly can't move. It's an oppression. And you get that sense of oppression in other Gothic novels as well, like in Rebecca, when you have those tea times and you have to gather around the table every day at 4:30 and she doesn't want to. But in Rosemary's Baby, it's really, really oppressive, and she is eating and ingesting things. Obviously, I won't give any spoilers in case someone hasn't read it, but she's feeding something which is highly dangerous, and that's introduced through this initial scene of a neighbor bringing some chocolate mousses, and she takes a bite, and then she has this dream, and so on and so forth. So it's really the idea of something entering your body that's then producing a nightmarish atmosphere and a nightmarish baby potentially. So I really love Rosemary's Baby for that reason, and you get lots of like stuff to do with witchcraft and things like that.
I think I remember when I read the novel, I think you get the sense of mountain dread a bit better than you do in the film.
Yeah.
But I think the whole time in the film, you're just like, leave, go on, leave, please now, leave, leave, leave. And she just doesn't. And,
She tries, and like she tries to go to the doctor, and even he's in. Oh, it's just yeah.
yeah.
It's really, 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 really great. Like I love that. And again, one of those books that when I read it the first time, didn't really notice food. Food is throughout the book, like till the very end when she tries to escape, food is there. So I think she tries to slip something in the coffee or the cheese sandwich, you know. So even towards the end, you have this sense of like poison all throughout, and threat and depression. Yeah.
Actually, I was just thinking it was interesting that you mentioned the haunting of Hill House there, because I suppose in a way the food's kind of used to show their isolation, that they've got to like serve themselves, and it's kind of left and then the people leave because the
Yes.
Dudleys don't want to be there.
No, they don't want to be there after 9. There's a time where it's just, you know, after sunset. There are lots of Dracula references. So it's nearly as if Mrs. Dudley is feeding the house with these people who have come to visit, and she says, "I will prepare everything for you. It will be ready at 9 a.m. or something, you know, for breakfast. It will be ready at this time for lunch and for dinner, and that's the only time that you can eat, and that's it, you know. And then I leave." And leave everything for me to kind of clean up the next day. But she doesn't stay a minute longer than she needs to. And again, through food, we get that sense of like impending doom. You know, what does this mean? And they comment on how wonderful the food is, but it nearly feels like it's fake. It's nearly there to lull them into some sort of false sense of security. It's like, don't worry, trust this house. The food is so great that, you know, for sure, nothing can be wrong if the food is so great. And actually, everything is wrong with that house. And food is that connection with goodness and bonding with each other that they have when they sit down at the table, but it's just a false sense of security. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking this is a long, long time since I've read the book. I think I need to go back and reread that.
She disappeared, Mrs. Dudley. I love that she disappears. There's like so many doors in the kitchen. Suddenly she's not there anymore. They often comment on this, and it's really creepy. I love it.
She's really creepy in the book of the film as well.
Yeah, the film is creepy, and all, but then they did. I think Bly Manor was based on.
Oh no, they just did the Haunting of Hill House one on Netflix.
Sorry, the Haunting of Hill House. Yeah, and I thought that was really creepy. And then the other one they did, I think, was The Turn of the Screw. Then. Yeah. But haunted house stories are wonderful, and the house itself acts as some sort of big oven, nearly. The oven scenes are something we haven't really talked about, but films like The Visit, where the grandmother asks the girl to get into the oven to clean it, and it's a really big oven. Things like that are very unsettling as well. So yeah, kitchen utensils in general, stay away.
Well, it just takes us back to the blender and Gremlins again, doesn't it?
But they are dangerous, you know. People do have accidents in kitchen.
I'm just wondering how they got that scene though in Gremlins into what was essentially a family film, because it is really gross.
Yes. Yeah, the 80s. What can I say? When I grew up, no wonder.
So I suppose obviously we've talked a lot about the Gothic, which is a fairly nebulous subject. I think at the best of times it is quite difficult to pin down. I think, particularly when everybody insists everything is Gothic in some ways. Yeah. But I think what's really interesting is when you watch the way it's kind of made that jump from academia to sort of more mainstream discussion as well. So in your opinion, what do you think sort of prompted that resurgence of interest or new interest for some people in the Gothic sort of outside of academia?
I think the Gothic is a really amazing genre. It allows, I think it's the genre where people are more self-published than any other. It allows for a reinterpretation of ideas. It has no boundaries. It's suspended. There are so many great things about the Gothic and the people who are in this Gothic community. I think that's one of the reasons why we have had a need recently for just more flexibility and openness, diversity, inclusion, and the Gothic offers all of this. And that's, I think, why people say everything is Gothic. But in many ways, it kind of, you can make it that way. And that's how it should be. And I think that's one of the core features of the Gothic, is that it is so malleable and flexible. and it does incorporate lots of different bits from different things, even folklore. You know, it actually shares many formal conceptual features with folklore and fairy tale and other genres as well. You can just mix it. I think that's the whole thing that makes it so attractive. And it's like rewriting something, but with in mind the aim to subvert it, so that you can analyze it again from the inside. And I think that's where Gothic food fits so nicely with the Gothic. It's looking at the insides, the intestines of the story. It's looking at it from the other point of view. And sometimes you can only get to that after a few rereadings, because you wouldn't notice it the first time around. But I think that's what makes it really creepy and sometimes difficult to digest as well.
Pardon the pun.
Yeah.
See what you did there. I was going to say, actually, do you think that there is much of a link between the use of food in the Gothic and folklore? Because I can think of quite a lot of sort of folklore related things around food. I mean, the first one that springs to mind would be that idea of always having to smash up your eggshells so that a witch can't use them to sail to sea and cause a storm and things like that. But do you see much of a crossover, or is it just because food in general is a bit weird?
I think food is like a carrier of a lot of meaning. So you see it in folklore and fairy tales, for example, in also quite biblical foods like the apple. And the apple's really interesting because the apple was used during the mystery plays to literally evoke a salivation, so that you could sympathize with the character that was on the stage. Because if you hear someone biting into the apple, your mouth automatically also salivates. I know it's never happened to me because we don't really have miracle and mystery plays anymore, but apparently that was the aim. And that's I think what the connection is. It makes things real. So I think that's real of anything, any food that's in folklore, any kind of food that also signifies maybe lack as well as or abundance, you know, so loss or hunger is extremely Gothic as well. And I think at the core idea of Gothic food is that it reminds us of our own, of the fact that we're not eternal. And I think, you know, fairy tales and folklore as well have that kind of aim, you know, how to get through life. But it's reminding us that there is an end in sight. And yeah, food is a connection to that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because obviously when you think about a lot of the food superstitions, I think they are about almost using food to kind of ward off something or to attract something into your life. Or I mean, I know there's a really weird one that you can apparently take a loaf, hollow out the middle, put quicksilver in it, and then if you float it on a river, it'll then find any dead bodies in the water. Who tried that? I don't know.
Food as a compass. Why not?
You don't see them on Silent Witness doing that, you know, but it is that, again, that sort of sense of, I guess, it's just another tool in your armory against kind of the forces of chaos.
Yes, but it's a tool that like other tools changes according to where you are in society and what's happening around you and culturally what's changing. So that's why it really is a compass, really, if you think about it, because it can really indicate where you're at and what's happening in your community at that point in time. So that's why it's so interesting as well.
Yeah, and also I'm just loving the fact that we've got to sit here and talk about food for so long as well.
Nothing better. Anytime.
This is the funny thing, I think, you know, when you think about, you know, what is the one thing that literally sort of binds all humans. Obviously things like the need for sleep would be one, but I guess the need to sustain yourself in some way is another one. And it's something that I think we can obviously, you know, share and so on.
Yeah, and in some communities it still has, you know, it has different meanings. So it can be that opportunity to bond around a table and to communicate. And in others, in lonelier existences, if you live, you know, without a larger family or whatever, you find yourself eating alone and your food habits will change. Maybe you'll be looking at your phone and watching TV at the same time. So it has become more of a pleasure as not so much an opportunity to communicate, but where you're resting, which is kind of the contradiction that is within consumption and food and consumption items in general. Like if you think of the word coffee, it means, well, originally to excite, you know, and to wake yourself up. but also now it has become a reason to have a break and to relax. So within that same concept, you can get that contrast. And I think that's what makes Gothic food so interesting.
Do you find that the food in Gothic literature is more associated with like the protagonists or the villains, or is it a bit of both?
I think it's a bit of both, and it can show what character the person has. So you might get someone who's in distress, or essentially a good character eating very plain things like Jane Eyre, very plain. Oh my gosh. Even when she had a fruit tart or a jam tart, she wouldn't go near it. She hadn't eaten for 3 days. I lose my mind. But anyway, and then you get the cousin, and he is greedy, and he's mean to Jane, and he overeats. And so you get him stuffing himself with meat. So again, meat versus non-meat has a really big significance in the Gothic, I think. And it is an indication of people's characters. Yes.
So speaking about villains, then, do you have a favorite Gothic villain, or which would you say is the best Gothic villain?
Oh, I have so many. I like the unsuspecting Gothic villain. There's that horrible one in The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, where he is, well, the idea of, the Bluebeard figure, I think he is a great villain. And he lures the victims in and showers them with food and champagne, and so really lures them in and makes them part of his castle, and again lulling them into a full sense of security through the availability of food. So often he preys on people who are poor. That's a real villain, and he's surrounded by luxury, so I also the association between the luxurious and someone who isn't accustomed to being poor or to saving anything. He's just really full immersion into luxurious items, and that's how he gets his victims, preying on their vulnerability. That's a real villain. So I do love him in The Bloody Chamber. Yeah. I love that he, sorry, there's a spoiler, but I love that he gets killed by the mum of the victim as well. Brilliant.
So, I did quite like that twist when I went back and I read it, and I'm just kind of like, go mom.
Yeah, I like them, and I like them dead.
Well, obviously, as we're sort of getting towards the end of our little chat, do you have a favourite recipe in A Gothic Cookbook?
Well, I've got a few. There's one that I've been trying recently again with Ella, which is the seafood casserole in Rosemary's Baby. It's called a Chilean chupe, and I love the way that she uses this to kind of reassert some sort of authority. It has mussels, clams, and then it's coated with breadcrumbs, and you put it in the oven, and it's really, really delicious. And in the 60s in New York, this Chilean seafood casserole recipe kind of meant that you were really, on top of your game, kind of in touch with internationally kind of savvy, and knew how to host a party, knew how to entertain. So I like that this is used as a symbol of that, and the comfort that brings as well. And it's her way, it's Rosemary's way of reasserting her authority. After Minnie brings her all these smoothies, she actually pours a smoothie which was poisoned, into the sink, and she prepares this chupe, Chilean chupe casserole, and it's her way of fighting back. So yeah, we have a bit of rebellion through food as well. So that's why I like that recipe. But each chapter will have around 5 recipes. Yeah, and that's one of my favorites.
Cool. So do you want to explain how Unbound works then? Because obviously it does have these different pledge levels, and obviously, so it's kind of a little bit like it, I guess, like Kickstarter for books.
Absolutely. And if you go on to our Unbound website and look us up, we're A Gothic Cookbook. There are different pledge levels. You can buy an ebook, you can buy a hardback, paperback, signed hardback. And then there are other pledge levels, like we have, for example, the Gothic Pet Portrait, which is quite fun, where Lee will draw a Gothic portrait of your pet, if you are so inclined. And then we have also a tea time where Ella and I will personally come and deliver you a tea time from Rebecca to your house, dressed as Mrs. Danvers and the second Mrs. De Winter. So that might be fun. And we've already had a pledge for that, so I can't wait. please do use our discount code, which is GothicPod10 for podcasts. And yes, and follow us on A Gothic Cookbook on Twitter and Instagram.
Yep, I'll put all the links in the show notes as well, just so people can then just go and click away. Because I know when I had a look, I noticed you had a cocktail recipe pamphlet one or something.
Yeah, we have a cocktail booklet as well, which is absolutely, like, I don't know how many people have pledged for that. So many pledges. And also you can buy more than one book at the same time to really help us. But really, we just have 6% to go now, so we're really proud of that.
Well, hopefully this will help. I know I'm going to go off and pledge. So this will hopefully help get a few more people as well. So have you got any final things you'd like to say about A Gothic Cookbook just before we wrap up?
No, just that we can't wait to get it out into the world. So exciting.
Best way of doing it. Well, it's been absolutely fabulous talking to you. Obviously, it's always nice geeking out about the Gothic with someone. I mean, you know, it's always fun. It's been lovely having you, and I hope that you get lots of pledges and the book gets funded, really.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks again for having me on, Icy. It really, really, really helps. Thanks.
My pleasure. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.